late on a rainy Tuesday evening. The kind where the sky seems to press down on the rooftops and the streets shimmer under the streetlights like wet glass. A woman sat in her car outside a 24-hour medical clinic. Her hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles had gone white. In the back seat, her 6-year-old son lay curled against the window, his breathing quick and shallow, his forehead burning hot even through the thick winter coat she'd wrapped him in. She'd checked his temperature again just 10 minutes ago. 104 degrees. That wasn't just a fever. That was danger. She'd already called their regular pediatrician twice, no answer. The urgent care center near their apartment had closed at 8 p.m., and the nearest emergency room was a 20-minute drive through gridlocked traffic and slick roads. But this clinic, the one on the edge of town tucked between a laundromat and a shuttered diner, was still open, its sign flickering weakly in the downpour. It wasn't ideal. She'd heard mixed things about it. But right now, not ideal was better than waiting until morning. She turned off the engine and took a slow breath, trying to steady herself. Not for her sake, for his. Kids picked up on fear faster than adults realized. If she panicked, he'd panic. And he was already scared enough. Earlier that evening, he'd woken up crying, clutching his throat, saying it hurt to swallow. Then came the chills, then the sweat, then the way his eyes glazed over like he wasn't quite all there. She'd tried children's fever reducers, cool cloths, honey water. Nothing touched it. That's when she knew. This wasn't just a cold. She unbuckled her seatbelt, turned around, and gently brushed a damp curl from his forehead. "Hey, baby," she whispered. "We're here. Just a little while longer, okay? They're gonna help you feel better." He nodded weakly, too tired to speak, and let her lift him into her arms. He was heavier than he used to be, 6 years old in all limbs. But she held him close, shielding him from the rain with her body as she hurried toward the clinic's glass doors. The automatic sensor beeped, and warm, antiseptic-scented air rushed over them. The waiting room was nearly empty. Just one man in a corner scrolling on his phone and a receptionist behind a high counter, typing with one hand while chewing gum with the other. "Name?" the receptionist asked without looking up. She gave it, then added, "My son's really sick. High fever, trouble breathing. I think he might have strep or something worse." The woman nodded, still not making eye contact, and slid a clipboard across the counter. "Fill this out. Someone'll call you when it's your turn." She wanted to argue, wanted to say, "He's not someone. He's a child who can barely keep his eyes open." But she bit her tongue. Arguing never helped. Not in places like this. Not when you looked like her. Instead, she found a chair near the wall, sat down carefully so as not to jostle him, and began filling out the form with one hand while cradling him with the other. His skin felt like a radiator. 10 minutes passed. Then 15. No one came. The man in the corner left. The receptionist took a phone call about someone's insurance. She watched the clock above the door tick forward, each second stretching longer than the last. Her mind raced through worst-case scenarios, meningitis, pneumonia, sepsis. But she forced herself to focus on the present, on his breathing, on the rise and fall of his chest. Finally, a door opened down the hall. A man in a white coat stepped out, clipboard in hand. "Carter?" he called, voice flat. She stood quickly. "Yes, that's us." He glanced at her, then at the boy in her arms, his expression unreadable. "Exam room 3, he said, turning without waiting. She followed. Heart pounding now, not from fear of the illness, but from that familiar, sinking feeling she got whenever she walked into a space where she knew she'd have to work twice as hard to be seen as half as credible. She'd spent years in courtrooms watching how people reacted when she spoke, how some leaned in, others leaned back, how tone, posture, even the cut of her clothes could shift someone's entire perception of her intelligence, her authority, her worth. Out here in scrubs and sneakers with her hair pulled back and dark circles under her eyes, none of that mattered. All they saw was a black woman with a sick kid, and for some that was enough to assume the worst. The exam room was small and cold, the paper on the table crinkling under Isaiah's weight as she laid him down. The doctor introduced himself as Dr. Kessler, but didn't offer a handshake or a smile. He asked a few quick questions. When did the fever start? Any rashes? Has he eaten? But his eyes kept darting to the door, like he was already thinking about the next patient. "He's been like this since dinner," she said, keeping her voice calm. He couldn't keep water down. His throat's so swollen he's whispering. Dr. Kessler nodded absently, then shone a light into Isaiah's eyes. "Open wide," he told the boy, who obeyed with effort. The doctor peered in, grunted, and stepped back. "Looks fine to me." "Fine?" she repeated, disbelief creeping into her tone. "He's running a 104-degree fever." "Fever's common this time of year," he said, scribbling something on his chart. "Probably viral. Rest, fluids, Tylenol. He'll bounce back." "But he's not acting like himself," she pressed, leaning forward. "He's lethargic, confused. That's not normal." Dr. Kessler paused, then looked at her, really looked at her for the first time. There was something in his gaze. A flicker of impatience, maybe suspicion. "You sure he didn't just stay up too late?" "Kids exaggerate when they're tired," she blinked. "Exaggerate?" "He can barely lift his head," he shrugged. "I've seen it before. Parents come in thinking it's an emergency, but it's just a little bug." She felt her chest tighten. Not anger. Not yet. But that sharp, familiar sting of being dismissed. Of having your concern twisted into something lesser. She took a breath. "With all due respect, I know my son. This isn't just a bug. Can we at least do a strep test? Or check his oxygen levels?" Dr. Kessler sighed. The kind of sigh people used when they thought you were wasting their time. "Look," he said, lowering his voice like he was doing her a favor. "We've got real emergencies coming through that door. I can't run tests on every kid who's got a sniffle because a parent's worried." The words landed like a slap, not because they were loud, but because they were quiet, delivered with the certainty of someone who assumed he was right, and she was overreacting simply because of who she was. She looked down at Isaiah. His eyes were closed now, his breathing uneven. And in that moment she made a choice. Not as a professional, not as a judge, not as anything but a mother. She would not leave without help. Not this time. "Then I'll wait," she said softly, meeting Dr. Kessler's eyes. "We'll wait right here until someone takes him seriously." The doctor's jaw tightened. He said nothing. Just turned and walked out, the door clicking shut behind him. Outside, the rain kept falling. Inside, a mother held her son and refused to be invisible. The silence after the doctor left felt heavier than the humid air in the exam room. It wasn't peaceful. It was tense, like the calm before a storm no one wanted to name. She sat on the edge of the crinkly, paper-covered table, one arm wrapped around her son, the other gently stroking his hair. His breathing was still too fast, too shallow, and every so often he'd shiver even though the room wasn't cold. She kept her eyes on the door, waiting. Not hoping, just waiting. Minutes ticked by. No nurse came in. No assistant. No one to check vitals, offer water, or even ask how they were doing. It was as if they'd been forgotten. Or worse, set aside on purpose. She knew that feeling. Not from this clinic, but from 100 other moments in her life. The cashier who watched her too closely in the store. The security guard who followed her through a department store, just in case. The way some people's voices changed when they realized she wasn't who they assumed she was. She'd learned long ago that being calm, polite, and clear didn't always protect you from being seen as a threat or a nuisance. But this wasn't about her. This was about him, and she wouldn't let pride or fear stop her from doing what she had to. She stood up carefully, making sure Isaiah stayed nestled against her side, and walked to the door. She cracked it open and peeked into the hallway. Empty. The reception desk was visible down the hall, the same woman still typing away, sipping from a coffee cup. No urgency. No concern. She stepped out, keeping her voice low but firm. "Excuse me," she called. "We've been waiting a while. My son still hasn't been properly examined. Can someone please check his oxygen levels or run a quick test?" The receptionist looked up, annoyed, like she'd been interrupted mid-thought. "The doctor already saw you," she said flatly. "He said it's viral." "That may be," she replied, "but I'd feel better if we ruled out something serious. Even a basic throat swab would help." The woman shrugged. "Not my call." She didn't snap. Didn't raise her voice, but something in her posture shifted, just slightly. She stood a little taller, her shoulders straightening. "Then whose call is it? Because if he gets worse, I'd rather it not be because we skipped a simple test." For the first time, the receptionist looked uneasy. She glanced toward the back offices, then mumbled, "I'll see if Dr. Kessler can come back." She nodded and returned to the exam room, closing the door behind her. She sat back down, pulled Isaiah into her lap, and whispered, "Hang in there, baby. We're not leaving until they help you." A few minutes later, footsteps approached. But it wasn't the doctor. It was a nurse, older with tired eyes and a name tag that read Linda. She carried a small tray with a thermometer and a blood pressure cuff. "Sorry for the wait," Linda said gently, her voice warm in a way the others hadn't been. "Let's get his vitals." Relief washed over her, quiet but real. Finally, someone who saw them as people, not problems. Linda checked Isaiah's temperature, still 103.8. His heart rate was elevated. His oxygen saturation was borderline low. She frowned. "He's working hard to breathe," she murmured, more to herself than anyone else. Then she looked up. "I'll let Dr. Kessler know." "Thank you," she said, meaning it. But when Linda returned, her expression had changed. Tighter, guarded. "He says it's still likely viral," Linda said, avoiding eye contact. "He doesn't want to run extra tests unless it's absolutely necessary." "Absolutely necessary?" she repeated, disbelief creeping in. "His oxygen's dropping. He's dehydrated. He can't speak above a whisper." "What more does he need?" Linda hesitated, then leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. "Look, I don't make the calls. But maybe if you act less insistent, he'll be more willing to help. Sometimes he gets defensive." The words stung, not because they were harsh, but because they were true, and because they placed the burden on her, to shrink, to soften, to pretend her worry wasn't valid just to get basic care for her child. She looked down at Isaiah. His eyes were half open, glassy with fever. He reached for her hand and squeezed it weakly. That was it. She stood again, this time with purpose. "I'm going to speak to him myself." Linda looked nervous. "I wouldn't," but she was already walking down the hall, Isaiah in her arms. She found Dr. Kessler in a small office, reviewing charts on a computer. He looked up, startled, then irritated. "I thought we were done," he said. "We're not," she said, voice steady. "My son's condition is worsening. His oxygen is low. He needs proper evaluation. If you won't do it, I'd like to speak to your supervisor or transfer him to the ER." Dr. Kessler leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "You're escalating this unnecessarily. I've examined him. There's no emergency. Then why won't you run a strep test?" she asked. "It takes 2 minutes. "Because," he said, his tone sharpening, "I've seen this before. Parents come in demanding tests they don't need, wasting resources, acting like the world revolves around their child. I have real patients." "Real patients?" she interrupted, her voice rising just enough to carry weight. "You think he's not real? You think I'm making this up for fun?" That's when his expression changed. Not to concern, not to understanding, but to something colder. Suspicion, maybe even fear, but not of her son's health. Of her. He stood abruptly. "You need to calm down." "I am calm," she said. "I'm asking for help. You're being aggressive," he shot back. "This isn't how you speak to medical staff," she blinked. Aggressive? She hadn't yelled, hadn't cursed, hadn't even raised her voice above a firm tone. But the label was already stuck to her like glue. Aggressive black woman. A stereotype so old it barely needed words anymore. Before she could respond, he stepped around his desk and walked past her, heading toward the front. She followed, heart pounding now, not from anger but from dread. She knew where this was going. In the hallway, he pulled out his phone, dialed quickly, spoke in a low voice, but she caught enough. "Yeah, I've got a situation. Black woman. Won't leave. Acting hostile. Might need police." Her stomach dropped. She stood there holding her sick child, watching the man who was supposed to heal people call the cops on her for asking questions. Isaiah stirred in her arms, whimpering softly. "Mama, I don't feel good." "I know, baby," she whispered, tears pricking her eyes. Not from fear of the police, but from the crushing weight of injustice wrapped in a white coat. "I know." Within minutes, red and blue lights flashed through the clinic's front windows. The automatic doors slid open and 2 officers stepped inside, boots clicking on the tile. One was young, fresh-faced, the other older, with a calm demeanor. The receptionist pointed toward her. Dr. Kessler stood nearby, arms crossed, looking satisfied. The older officer approached slowly. "Ma'am, everything okay?" She met his eyes, holding her son close. "My son is very sick. I asked for medical help. The doctor refused and called you instead." The officer glanced at Dr. Kessler, then back at her. He took in Isaiah's pale face, the sweat on his brow, the way he clung to her like a lifeline. "Is that true?" he asked the doctor. Dr. Kessler shifted. She was being disruptive. I felt unsafe. The officer didn't look convinced. He turned back to her. Do you feel safe right now? Yes, she said. But my son needs a doctor who will actually treat him. The officer nodded. We're not here to remove you. If you want to stay and seek care, that's your right. Relief, sharp and sudden, but it didn't erase the humiliation, the betrayal, the fact that a child's suffering had been ignored because of who his mother was. She walked back to the exam room, the officers lingering near the entrance, just in case. She sat down again, Isaiah curled against her chest. She rocked him gently, humming a lullaby he loved even though her hands were shaking. Outside, the rain hadn't stopped. Inside, something had broken, and something else had begun to rise. Not rage, not yet, but resolve, because no one should have to prove they deserve care, and no child should suffer while adults play games with dignity. The police stayed just long enough to make sure no one got dragged out the door, then left with a quiet nod and a promise to file a report if needed. The clinic fell back into that strange hush, too quiet for a place meant to heal people. The receptionist avoided her eyes. The nurse, Linda, peeked in once but didn't say anything, just gave a small helpless shrug before disappearing again. And Dr. Kessler? He didn't come back at all. She sat in that exam room for another hour, holding her son as his fever ebbed and flowed like a tide she couldn't control. She wiped his face with a damp paper towel, whispered reassurances she wasn't sure she believed, and watched the clock like it held answers. Every minute felt like a gamble. Stay and hope someone finally steps up, or leave and risk his condition worsening on the road to the ER. But leaving felt like surrender, like letting them win, and she wasn't ready to do that, not when the only thing she'd done was ask for help. Eventually, Isaiah drifted into a fitful sleep, his breathing still too fast, his skin still too hot. She knew then she couldn't wait any longer, not for pride, not for principle. For him. She stood, bundled him back into his coat, and walked out of the exam room without looking at anyone. The automatic doors hissed open, and the cold night air hit her like a slap. Rain had slowed to a drizzle, but the streets were slick, the world blurred under streetlights and passing headlights. She strapped Isaiah into his car seat, buckled him in gently, and started the engine. The heater kicked on, blowing warm air over his face. He stirred but didn't wake. As she pulled away from the clinic, she glanced in the rearview mirror. The building looked small now, insignificant, but the weight of what happened inside clung to her like wet clothes. She drove straight to the children's hospital downtown. No detours, no second-guessing. This time she wouldn't accept fine as an answer. She parked in the emergency lot, lifted Isaiah from the back seat, and walked through the ER doors with her head high and her voice clear. Unlike the clinic, this place moved with purpose. Nurses called out triage questions before she even reached the desk. Within minutes, Isaiah was on a gurney, oxygen monitor clipped to his finger, IV fluid started, and a pediatrician kneeling beside him, speaking softly, listening intently. Strep throat with possible secondary infection, the doctor said after a quick exam and a rapid test. His tonsils are swollen shut in places. No wonder he couldn't breathe right. We'll start antibiotics now and keep him overnight for observation. She nodded, tears finally spilling over, not from fear anymore, but from relief so deep it ached. Someone had seen them. Someone had believed her. While Isaiah slept under soft hospital lights, she sat in a plastic chair beside his bed, watching the steady rise and fall of his chest. The anger she'd held back all night began to surface, not loud or explosive, but quiet and sharp, like a blade being honed. It wasn't just about one rude doctor. It was about the pattern, the assumption that her concern was drama, not distress, that her presence was a threat, not a plea, that her child's pain wasn't urgent because she didn't fit the picture of who deserved urgent care. She thought about all the mothers who didn't have a car to drive to another hospital, who didn't have the energy to fight after working double shifts, who were talked down to, ignored, or worse, and had no recourse. She'd been lucky, not because of privilege, but because she knew how to navigate systems, how to speak the language of authority, how to stay calm when every instinct screamed to yell. But luck shouldn't be the deciding factor in whether a child gets help. The next morning, Isaiah's fever broke. He opened his eyes, clear and bright for the first time in days, and whispered, "Mama, I'm hungry." She laughed, a real laugh, shaky but full of light, and squeezed his hand. "You're gonna eat like a king today." Later, while he napped again, she stepped outside the hospital for fresh air. She pulled out her phone, not to post online or call the news, but to make a quiet call to the hospital's patient relations department. She described everything: the dismissal, the refusal to test, the police call, not with outrage but with precision. She gave names, times, details. She asked for a formal review, not for revenge, for accountability. What she didn't say, what no one knew yet, was who she really was. Back home, people saw her as a mom, a neighbor, a woman who bought groceries, waited in school pickup lines, and worried about bedtime routines. But in another world, she wore a black robe, sat behind a bench, and made rulings that shaped lives. She'd spent years listening to testimony, weighing facts, seeing how power tilted the scales, and now she'd been on the other side of that imbalance. She didn't plan to reveal her title. Not yet, but she also wouldn't let this slide. Because if she, someone with education, composure, and access, could be treated this way, what happened to those with less? Over the next 2 days, Isaiah recovered quickly under proper care. By the third morning, he was bouncing on the hospital bed, asking if he could have pancakes for breakfast. She smiled, kissed his forehead, cool now, blessedly cool, and packed their things. But as they walked out of the hospital hand in hand, she made a silent promise this wouldn't end here. She didn't want headlines. She didn't want the doctor fired on the spot. She wanted change, real, lasting change. Training, oversight. A system where a mother's voice wasn't drowned out by bias before she even finished her sentence, and she knew exactly how to start. Because sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do isn't to shout, but to show up, in a suit with a badge, and ask the right questions. The clinic had thought they were dealing with just another worried parent. They had no idea they'd just summoned a storm wearing scrubs and sneakers. 3 days after her son came home from the hospital, pink-cheeked, energetic, and demanding extra syrup on his waffles, she put on a navy suit she hadn't worn in weeks. Not because she had court that day, but because some truths land harder when they're delivered in the right uniform. She clipped her judicial badge to her belt, tucked her hair into a neat bun, and drove back to the clinic. Not as a patient, not as a complaining parent, but as who she really was. She walked through the same automatic doors, past the same reception desk, but this time everything felt different. The air was the same, stale, tinged with antiseptic, but her presence cut through it like a blade. The receptionist looked up, recognized her instantly, and froze mid-sip of her coffee. Her eyes darted to the back hallway, then back to the woman standing calmly in front of her. "I'm here to speak with the clinic administrator," she said, voice even, polite, but carrying a weight that couldn't be ignored. The receptionist swallowed hard. "Do you have an appointment?" "No," she replied, "but I think you'll want to make time." Within minutes, a man in a slightly wrinkled button-down shirt appeared, mid-40s, sweating at the temples, name tag reading Mr. Ellis, Operations. He greeted her with a nervous smile that didn't reach his eyes. "How can I help you today?" She didn't sit, didn't soften her tone. "My name is Judge Carter," she said, and let the title hang in the air like a bell that had just been struck. "Last Tuesday night, I brought my 6-year-old son here with a high fever, difficulty breathing, and signs of severe infection. I was denied basic diagnostic care. My concerns were dismissed. And when I insisted on proper evaluation, Dr. Kessler called the police on me, claiming I was aggressive and hostile." Mr. Ellis's face went pale. He glanced around as if hoping someone would rescue him. I wasn't on duty that night," he stammered. "I know," she said gently. "That's why I'm speaking to you now. Not to accuse, to correct." She pulled a folder from her briefcase, copies of the ER discharge summary, the lab results confirming strep and a secondary bacterial infection, the police report filed by the officers who responded. She laid them on the counter, one by one, like pieces of evidence in a case that needed no jury. "Your doctor didn't just misdiagnose my son," she continued. "He let bias override his medical judgment. He assumed I was exaggerating, that I was a problem, not a parent. And instead of treating a sick child, he treated me like a threat." Mr. Ellis stared at the papers, then at her, His mouth opened, closed, opened again. I had no idea. I know you didn't, she said. But now you do. She didn't raise her voice, didn't threaten lawsuits or media exposure. She simply stood there, calm, composed, undeniable, and asked for what should have been automatic: an internal review, mandatory bias training for all clinical staff, and a clear protocol for handling patient concerns without calling law enforcement. By noon, hospital leadership had been notified. By that afternoon, Dr. Kessler was placed on administrative leave pending investigation. Surveillance footage from the clinic confirmed her account. No yelling, no aggression, just a mother asking questions while holding a feverish child. The police report backed her up too. Even the nurse Linda gave a statement describing how the doctor had brushed off clear signs of distress. Word spread, not through social media outrage, but through quiet channels, medical boards, ethics committees, hospital administrators who knew that when a federal judge walks into your clinic with documentation, you listen. Dr. Kessler, it turned out, had a pattern. 2 prior complaints in the last 3 years. One from an elderly Latina woman denied pain medication, another from a Middle Eastern father whose concerns about his daughter's asthma were labeled anxious and overbearing. Both had been filed away, minimized, forgotten. Until now. But this wasn't just about one doctor. It was about a system that allowed assumptions to replace assessment. That treated certain voices as noise instead of signals. That made families choose between dignity and care. She didn't ask for Dr. Kessler to be fired outright. She asked for accountability and for learning. Because punishment without change was just theater. Real justice meant making sure the next mother who walked through those doors, tired, scared, maybe speaking with an accent or wearing worn shoes, would be heard the first time she spoke. A week later, the clinic's Parent Health Network announced a new patient advocacy program. A trained liaison would be available during all hours to support families who felt unheard. All clinical staff would undergo annual implicit bias and cultural competency training, developed in partnership with local health equity organizations. And a clear policy was put in place. Police would only be called in true emergencies involving physical threat, not for attitude or tone. She read the press release with quiet satisfaction. Not because she'd won, but because someone else might not have to go through what she did. At home, her son ran through the living room laughing, chasing the family dog. He'd been back to school for 2 days full of energy, telling his friends he beat the germs. He didn't understand the weight of what had happened. And she was glad for that. Childhood should be light, safe, full of pancakes and playgrounds, not police lights and dismissed pain. But she remembered, and she would keep remembering so others wouldn't have to. Because sometimes the most powerful thing a person can do is show up twice, once as a mother pleading for help, and once as the law demanding better. Months passed. The rain that had soaked the streets the night everything began was long gone, replaced by the golden light of early autumn. Leaves turned amber and rust, crunching underfoot as kids walked to school and neighbors waved from porches. Life moved on, as it always does. But for one family, the echo of that night never fully faded. Not as a wound, but as a compass. Her son was back to his usual self, laughing too loud at dinner, building pillow forts, asking 100 questions before bedtime. He'd ask sometimes, "Mama, do you think that doctor's sorry?" She'd pause, then say, "I don't know." But what matters is that he and others learn how to do better. She didn't want him growing up bitter. She wanted him growing up wise. She hadn't gone public with her story. No interviews. No viral posts. She believed real change happened in rooms where policies were written, not just in headlines that flared and faded, but that didn't mean she stayed silent. One Saturday morning, she stood at the front of a community health conference held in a downtown auditorium. The room was full: doctors, nurses, hospital administrators, medical students, even a few patient advocates who'd been fighting this fight for years. She wasn't there as a judge that day. She introduced herself simply. "I'm a mother. And a few months ago I almost lost my son. Not to illness, but to assumption." She told the story plainly. No dramatic pauses. No finger pointing. Just facts, feelings, and a question. How many others have been turned away because they didn't look, sound, or act like the ideal patient? The room was quiet when she finished. Not out of guilt, but recognition. A young resident in the back wiped her eyes. An older physician nodded slowly as if seeing his own past choices in a new light. Afterward, people lined up to talk, not to apologize, but to ask, what can we do differently? That was the moment she knew her silence had served its purpose. Now her voice could serve a bigger one. She began working quietly with regional health networks, helping design training modules that didn't just check a box but actually changed behavior. Role-playing scenarios where staff practiced listening without judgment. Workshops on how stress, poverty, or language barriers could be mistaken for non-compliance. She insisted that patient feedback, not just clinical outcomes, be part of staff evaluations. Because care wasn't just about curing, it was about seeing. Back in her courtroom, she noticed subtle shifts too. When cases involving medical neglect or institutional bias came before her, she asked sharper questions. Not to punish, but to understand the roots. She encouraged mediation over punishment when systems, not just individuals, were at fault. Justice, she believed, wasn't only about consequences. It was about correction. One afternoon, while reviewing case files, she received a letter. Plain envelope. No return address. Inside was a handwritten note from a woman who'd read about the clinic's new advocacy program in a local newsletter. She wrote that last winter, she'd taken her daughter to that same clinic with a rash and high fever. The staff had been kind. The nurse asked how she was holding up. The doctor ran tests without being asked twice. I didn't know why they were so different, the letter said, until I read your story. Thank you for making space for people like me. She folded the letter carefully and placed it in her desk drawer, the one she kept for reminders of why the work mattered. She never sought to shame Dr. Kessler. In fact, months later, through professional channels, she learned he'd completed the required training and requested a transfer to a rural clinic where he now worked under close supervision. Whether he'd truly changed, she couldn't say. But the system around him had, and that was something. What stayed with her most wasn't the injustice, but the quiet courage of the nurse, Linda, who'd spoken up despite fear of retaliation. Or the police officers who'd chosen empathy over assumption. Or the hospital administrator who, instead of circling the wagons, opened the door to reform. Change wasn't just about the powerful acting. It was about ordinary people choosing to do the right thing even when it was inconvenient. At home, she made a new rule. Every Sunday, no work. Just pancakes, board games, and long walks with her son. He'd ask about her job sometimes. Do you send bad people to jail? He'd wonder. Not exactly, she'd say. I help make sure everyone gets treated fairly. Even when it's hard. He'd nod like that made perfect sense, and maybe it did. Because fairness wasn't a grand gesture. It was 1,000 small choices. Listening when someone speaks, believing them when they say they're hurting, and never letting your assumptions speak louder than their truth. Years from now, people might forget the details of that rainy night, the clinic, the fever, the flashing lights. But the ripples would remain. In training rooms where new doctors learned to see the person, not the stereotype. In waiting areas where mothers no longer had to steel themselves before speaking up. In policies that said clearly and without exception, every patient deserves dignity. Full stop. She never wanted to be a symbol. She just wanted to be a mom who got help for her child. But sometimes, standing up for your own child means building a safer world for someone else's. And that was enough. Because in the end, the most powerful revolutions don't always start with a shout. Sometimes, they start with a mother's whisper. Please, just look at my son. And someone finally does.